your glass up high. Turn it up, it's time. Tall boy on the line. Loud breeze, they will laugh. Raise your...
Welcome back to episode 297 of the Tall Boy Radio podcast. And as we always say, who knows where it goes when the beer flows? Well, we had a guest on from Pennsylvania not so long ago, and we're going to be talking a little bit of Pennsylvania once again. But before I do, we have to note the fact that we are now 99% of the way towards episode 300. Now, fans of numbers among you will know 99 and the episode 297 are not strobogrammatic. But I tell you what is strobogrammatic. The number 222, and this is Gaz's 222nd episode.
Yeah, evening all, evening will. 222, and I wouldn't have thought I'd have got there many moons ago when I sat and recorded episode 1. But anyway, enough about me, and let's move on to this evening's episode. And look, it's always great when we have guests from over the pond. It's always great when we have new guests, and I can't wait to get into it. Really looking forward to this episode. Can't wait to listen to some of the stories that are going to be on offer, and get to know Bruce a little bit more.
Indeed. So yeah, this week we are joined by another true crime author. His name is Bruce Mowday, and amongst one of the books that I have here that he's written, I'm going to be talking about today is the title of the episode, Jailing the Johnston Gang. He's written a few other books, and maybe we'll touch on those as well. Bruce, did you want to say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, absolutely, I do. Hello, and thank you both for having me as a guest on the show. And just to let you know, number 297 is my favorite number.
Excellent.
At least it is now, so that's great. Thank you. And my book, Jailing the Johnston Gang, actually took part about 3 years of my life. I was a newspaper reporter, and I covered the courthouse beat, and I came across these guys, 3 brothers, and they were really good burglars, but they overstepped themselves when they started killing people. And what set them apart from other murderers is that their victims happened to be members of their own gang and members of their own family. These guys were ruthless. They would do anything to stay out of prison. And even when the leader, Bruce Johnston Sr., his brother started to rat on him, and he did so because his father raped his 15-year-old girlfriend. So, you know what kind of people you're talking about. That's when he started, and that's when Senior said, enough of that. You violated the family law. You don't cooperate with police. And so that started off a series of events that led to an ambush that the son was shot multiple times and recovered, but his 15-year-old girlfriend was shot once right in the chin, and she died a few minutes later. This story goes on for a number of years. They were involved in stealing almost anything that wasn't kind of nailed down. One of their favorites was Corvettes, the really nice car, and they would not drive them around. They would take them to their own chop shop and take every piece off of them and sell them and make a lot of money. But they stole large construction equipment. They stole small ones. They were known for the stealing of John Deere garden tractors. Right. In fact, there were more John Deere garden tractors stolen in their area than the rest of the nation combined. But they also did heavy construction equipment, and they would steal to order. If you needed something for your home or your car, you put in an order, and the next day they'd have it for you for half price. They had a great distribution. Like I said, they all had specialties. They had their weapons people. They had somebody who was an expert in blowing up safes. I don't think he was quite that expert, because some of his blowing up the safes just blew up everything inside of it too. But he did that. They had lookouts. They were pretty well in organized crime for a suburban Philadelphia, and Chester County, where they operated, is about 30 miles west of the city of Philadelphia. Pretty much at that time, horse country, a lot of big horse shows there. It was pretty close to Wilmington and the big DuPont company, but it was pretty rural, and there weren't that many police people out there, and they took advantage of it. One of my first stories about Bruce Johnston Sr. when he was a youngster and committing his first crimes, he was in prison, and he went up to the ward, or the future warden saw him. He was a guard then, and said, "Who is this guy strutting around?" And he went up to him and asked the guy's name. He said, "Well, I'm Bruce Johnston Sr. I'm the best burglar in Chester County." And I would have said, "Then what are you doing in Chester County Prison?" They did. He did not. But the senior went on to explain part of his MO and what he'd do, because it was at night and there was only a few state policemen patrolling a large area. You drive by the state police station, and if both of their cars were on station, he knew the whole county was open up to them, and they could steal whatever they want. Sometimes they would put in a call for a false alarm and went into the air coverage area and go and commit crimes at the others. They were good burglars. They were just awful murderers.
Yeah.
Wow. No, I was just going to ask you. So you mentioned there that it was quite a rural sort of setting, and Philly wasn't that far away. So did they ever consider sort of widening their area of sort of crime, or were they involved with any other gangs as such, or was it very, very much just like a local sort of operation?
Well, they were a local gang, and when I say gang, there was like maybe 20, 23 people involved, but they didn't trust each other. And
Right.
they wouldn't go out on crimes together. So, that part was compartmentalized.
Right.
They knew better, I think, than kind of expanding into Philadelphia. I had the Philadelphia mob there. They had the mob connections, and some of their fences have really good connections with Philadelphia and New York City, because we're not that far from New York City. And they had a whole network where they could distribute goods. And they committed crimes not only here in Chester County, but all the way up into New York State and down south. The family connections were actually in like southern Tennessee. So
Right.
they had connections there. So they did a lot of crimes. They were all over. But they mainly hit right there in Chester County. And Chester County, it's a fairly wealthy. Like I said, the DuPonts were there, the Campbell Soup Fortune. Some of their people were there. A lot of antiques. It goes way back in the history. So they had a lot of rich pickings right there, but they did have tentacles to kind of move them around. So they had loose connections. Occasionally, they would venture out too far. They stole some drugs from another, gang, and that led to a lot of issues at one point. But they were pretty fearless, and they weren't above, as we now know, of shooting people that got in their way. The one brother, Bruce Johnston Sr., was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder. I'm convinced he did 10, and some people thought he did more. He thought he was a charmer. At one point, I spent 2 hours in a jail cell interviewing him.
What was that like then? Knowing you're sat down with somebody who has taken a number of lives, you think he's taken more, and many people think that he's taken even more than the 10 that you think he's taken. What was it like sat down in a cell with him?
Yeah, you got to remember, I was a young and probably dumb reporter at the time, and I really, really, really wanted that interview. And this was there was 2 murder trials. Bruce Johnston Sr. went on trial for 6 murders, and his 2 brothers, Norman and David, were the other 2 kind of leaders of the gang. They were only charged with 5, so they actually had 2 separate trials. And the first one were the 2 brothers out in western Pennsylvania, and it went on for like 6 weeks. I covered it. Nice town, nice people, but it snowed like every day. It was kind of struggle getting there and getting back. But that went off, and right after they were convicted of 4 of the murders, there was actually one body that was never recovered. That was everybody said was buried in a landfill. under the trash, and they were acquitted of that one. But what happened with between the first trial and the second trial, every reporter, and there were tons of reporters there from the big magazines, the big network TV stations, all the local, every time I walked in the into the courthouse, you tripped over a reporter or two, or that many of them, and we all trying to get an interview with Senior, and he was saying no, and his attorneys, of course, were saying no. But then the big break came. He was being housed in Delaware County Prison, which is right next to us and between us and Philadelphia. And lo and behold, he was suffered some injuries. Apparently, what happened, I learned the full story later. So what happened was, Bruce liked some of his marijuana and different stuff. And one day, the guards brought in a drug sniffing dog. And they, of course, went right for Senior's cell, and Senior didn't want to be caught with the drugs, so he started a fire with his mattress, and it smoked up, and subduing him and putting out the fire and getting him out of the cell. He suffered a number of injuries. I think he had cracked ribs and some other stuff. He was not in, he was roughed up, and all, I think, to his own doing. So shortly after that, there was a hearing in Chester County Court on the murder charges, and I covered both of the trials and all the hearings, and this was again like 3 years of my life. I was out the nights they were digging up bodies of the victims too, but that particular day I went, and I knew Bruce had suffered these injuries. And the courthouse and the police were really afraid that they would try to break out, and they had their gang members out there. So they would move him out of the courthouse different ways every time he was there, so people couldn't kind of make a plan. I knew that was going on, so that morning I went up to one of the court personnel, and I just said, "Which way today?" And they told me he was coming down the back stairs and out the front doors, and thank you. So I went in, listened to the hearing. Senior was up there testifying about whatever, or he didn't testify, whatever the hearing was. And when it was concluded, he started, of course, under police guard, walking out of the courthouse. So I jumped out ahead of him down the back stairs, and I was waiting at that door when he walked out. And I just said, "Bruce, talk to me now." And he said, "Yes, but just about being beaten up." I said, "That's fine." So I went back to my office there in the newsroom, and I called the warden, and I had a fairly decent relationship with the warden. And he said, "If you want to talk to Senior, you need to do it tonight. I'm shipping him out in the morning." And I said, "Fine, I'll be there." So that evening I went, and I had my tape recorder and my pen and pencil, and that was about it. And the warden had left instructions to put me in a jail cell with Senior, and we sat there for 2 hours doing the interview. A lot of people have asked me, "Weren't you afraid?" I'm thinking, not really. I really wanted to do that interview. Plus, he had agreed to it, and I think he knew that at least I'd sit there and I'd talk with him. Not that I believed much of anything he said, but at least I'd sit there and talk to him. And other reporters wouldn't even, say, "Hey, you've been charged with murder. What do you say?" And that's what reporters really should do. At least I went there and I talked with him. So we're there, and usually when I interview people, if I want to record it, I'll say, "Hey guys, can I record it?" And I have a tape recorder, and if they say no, I won't. With this one, I was sure I wanted it to tape record it because I wanted to make sure I had a record of it. So I just sat it down, turned it on, and I said, "Bruce, we're going to record this." And he said, "Okay." So, so I could record it, and it came into play pretty interesting later. So for the first hour, he just wanted to talk about being abused. He admitted to being a thief, but not a murderer, and he was all there just because his reputation, and he didn't have anything to do with those 6 murders. That was the story. Took an hour. Second hour, I got him into his alibis for the murder. and he just laid out his alibi. So he wasn't there. He was with another gang member on one night, and they were at a bar and spent lots and lots of money on prostitutes, so people would realize they were there when the murder of the 15-year-old was being done by Bruce Sr.'s two brothers, Norman and David. So they got all of this kind of alibis going on. And so I was pretty good. I had, the interview I wanted, and, did about a 3-part series that went, a few weeks later after I got everything together and verified different things. We had a really nice story, which I was grateful for, and of course only one to have it. Where this really comes into effect is during his trial. His trial's taken place, it goes on, weeks and weeks and weeks. Prosecution brings in all these testimony. It's now the time for the defense. And one of the first witnesses is Bruce Johnston Sr. He gets up, he gets onto the courtroom. He doesn't do it. He's, a thief, not a murderer, misunderstood, and he gives his alibi. So it comes time for the cross-examination by the DA. And the DA didn't say a word at first. Matter of fact, he got up and left the well of the courtroom and came back into the visitors gallery. And I was sitting at a end seat. He just came back at me, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "Mr. Johnston, do you know this man?" And Bruce Johnston said, "Yes, that's Bruce Mowday from the Daily Local News. Did you give him an interview?" And he said, "Yes." And the DA had picked up something different than the interview that he testified to. He said, "Didn't you tell Mr. Mowday this?" And, I'm sitting there cringing. What is he going to say? And he said, "Well, if Mr. Mowday said I did, I did." And I'm thinking, whoa. And so that kind of destroyed his alibi too. That, and there was they had tons of evidence against him. But, sitting there and, kind of fit together with that interview I got to do at the prison. It was a big coup for me and for our newspaper. And we were pretty much out in front of it. The paper I worked for was the largest local paper in Chester County, where most of the crimes took place. And we were kind of out front in it. You want another story along those lines? I kind of like.
Yeah, that's right. I just want to one question really about you. At that point when the DA tapped you on the shoulder and do you know this man, and you were worried about what he was going to ask and what he was going to say. Were you ever worried about any sort of repercussions from the family towards you personally? Because obviously, from what he said to you in that interview, potentially destroyed his alibis and everything else, and that led to him being convicted, I assume. So were you ever worried that there would be some repercussions and that the family would come and, try to find you or do something to you?
Well, luckily at that point, all the really murderous ones were behind jail.
Okay. So it's safe then. That's fine then.
so that was better. But there were other dangerous ones still around in a number of years. And I think I was lower on the list. Some of the gang members that testified against them and the judge and the attorneys were probably a little bit higher up than the rest. One of the other stories I thought was really interesting. One of the gang members, a guy named Leslie Dale, had, after being kind of put in a box on another murder charge, agreed to testify against the Johnstons, and he led the police to one of the victims. And that was kind of late in November of one of the years. And on New Year's Eve, I received a telephone call that they had 3 more bodies out of the ground, the 3 kids that were killed by the Johnstons. And I went and, I did everything I could that evening. And before I filed this story, I got a call from one of the investigators. And this was New Year's Day, and he had apparently had a few too many tall boys. And his wife was giving him a hard time about his organization not getting the publicity or the credit for all the work they'd done. So he called me at home, And he was saying, yeah, we got 3 more bodies. You don't know who even led us there. And I assumed the same as everybody else. It was Leslie Dale, the same person. And he said, nah, you're wrong. It was Ricky Mitchell. And he was another paid contract killer. And he, kind of laid it out for me. So the next day I'm in the newsroom and, typing up my story, and I have it, Ricky Mitchell, leads the police to these 3 bodies. And I remember my publisher coming up and tapping me on the shoulder, same as the DA, and said, you know, every other organization has Leslie Dale giving us information. I looked up to him. I said, nope, it was Ricky Mitchell. And the paper trusted me at that point. So we were the only one to have the correct information on it. It was pretty interesting the way it went.
So can you tell us then a little bit more about the gang, Bruce Senior, Norman, and David? So they were the 3 brothers. How did they go from stealing farm equipment, stealing Corvettes, and then take it on to the next level, and homicides? How did they start to bridge that gap? How did that come about?
Yeah, the family really had roots in Mountain City, Tennessee, and the DA called them ridge runners, that they were kind of, the southern kind of criminals that kind of were loose. Mother moved to Pennsylvania, married a Quaker. The father was a Quaker, a lot older than the mother, died, so the mother was bringing them up by themselves. And they had a few legitimate jobs, but I think they figured out earlier on they rather not work, get easy money. They like fast cars and horses and women, and not having to work for it. So they really gravitated to that crime. Like I said, they spent a little bit of time in prison, so they learned by it, and they honed their craft. They got a nice network. They had some really good informants, such as antique dealers. They would say, hey, look, go and rob that house over there. And by the way, take the first painting. The next 2 are junk. Take the next one. So they know what they were doing once they got in there. And they took them. So they started doing this, and they became a little bit more violent as they went. There's one story of an elderly couple, or an older couple. I hate the term elderly. An older couple that went out to dinner, and they were rumored to have a lot of money on hand. And the Johnstons were waiting for them, and the couple came home, opened up their electronic garage door, car went in, and the Johnstons went in before that garage door came down. Well, they didn't have that money that was rumored, but the Johnsons thought they were holding out on them, and they just beat them unmercifully. Ended up in the hospital, and they were beaten so bad they would never go home to their home again. So they were definitely getting more violent. They also were getting away with a lot of stuff, and why they got away with it to a large extent was that they were intimidators. There was one district justice who said, I'll never find them guilty of a crime. I don't want the wrath on me. They threatened police officers. They threatened witnesses, especially. One of my favorite stories, one of the farmers who had a tractor stolen, he was going to testify before a court. And that morning he went out to get into his truck, and on that seat was a stick of dynamite. It's a pretty clear message. You're not going to go there and testify against these guys. So they became brazenly, if you're a member of the community, you either got along with them or you just went on the other side of the road and you just, kind of avoided them. And they kind of liked that. And they thought they were kind of kings and could get away with anything. And they didn't want to go to jail, and they hated police informants. The first murder that we're kind of sure of was a police informant that the brothers were pretty sure that he was telling the police about them. And one night they were at a bar and they invited him to come along to do a theft. The guy's name was Gary Crouch. Gary didn't want to go, but he really didn't have any choice. He was in the front seat, Leslie Dale, the one of the killers was in the back seat, and Senior was driving. They stole a car, and they were on a back road, supposedly going to a burglary, and that's when Dale shot him in the back of the head. They buried him, as they did for a lot of the victims. Matter of fact, of the 6 murder victims, the police really didn't have a body until the 6th one. So, that was part of what they did. So people were missing, but no bodies. And they took the car, burned it, and Grouch was missing for over a year, before he was found.
Sorry, do you think that they and you mentioned then that they didn't like, they were quite intimidatory to the police and they were threatened. Do you think that they had any of the local police on their payroll as such? Were they that big that they would effectively pay the police off not to be arrested, turn the other way, or was it just the fact the police were afraid of them?
A good question. And there's been rumors to that effect. I really don't think so. I think what happened, that some of the local police officers probably talked too much and maybe talked to Johnston's associates and were overheard of what was going on. And I really think from everything I saw that there's probably more loose lips and people
Right.
being paid by the police, and knowing some of the police at the time, that wouldn't surprise me. The Johnstons had their ways of getting information, but I never heard. They had really good attorneys, and that's one of the things they spent their money on. And matter of fact, they went through most of the attorneys in the Chester County Bar Association. Represented somebody. When the last of the murder trials came up, to get a conflict counsel, they had to go out of county because just about everybody had represented them, or a family member or a witness or something in the past, so there wouldn't be a conflict. So they had good legal representation. When they did go to prison, they got good deals, plea bargains. There was just, they did what they could to, kind of stay out of prison.
How long was their run then? How long, were the intimidating folk and committing their crimes?
Bruce Johnston Sr., actually, the oldest one, started in, he was a teenager in the late 1950s, and they kind of learned their trade through the 60s. And where it all kind of came apart was late in 1970. As a matter of fact, the big killing month was August of 1978. So they were around a fairly long time. The trials were in early 1980s, and their legacy goes on because the son, Bruce Johnston Jr., who was shot when his 15-year-old girlfriend died. And I saw him testify like a few months after the shooting. It was amazing. And he was pointing out all the areas in his body where the bullets hit, and the bullets going around his scalp and in and out. And he survived, but he couldn't identify the shooters, and the shooters were his uncles, Norman and David. But, you would thought that would have been enough to steer Junior away from crime, but it wasn't. He actually married a woman named Robin, and they were arrested breaking into a pharmacy. Over the years, he was pretty much a drug dealer. And he was arrested for selling meth some years later. And I talked with the arresting officer, who was an undercover police officer, and he said, I really felt sorry for Junior. It was like that's all he knew. And he was really proud of his recipe for meth. And everybody said it was really bad anyway, but, that's what he wanted to talk about. So he ended up going back to prison for, I think it was another 10 years. Got out several years ago. And wouldn't you know, before long, he was back in prison on parole violation. And, people say, he didn't have a chance from, his father, and everybody was. Certainly didn't have a great upbringing, but he certainly also never did anything to straighten himself out during all these years. It's really a mess.
Yeah. One question: you mentioned that you'd interviewed Senior as such. Did you interview any of the others or did you get a one-on-one with them as such? Or was it just senior really that you spoke to?
My big interview was senior, but I knew all the criminals and
Right.
the murderers, and through covering and being in the courthouse. I'll tell you a story I'll tell you David Norman, and I'll go back to the Leslie Dale thing. Because of all the publicity, and I wrote many of the articles, they moved the trial from Chester County to another county in Pennsylvania. And there was a hearing, and I went up to cover it, and I went into the courtroom, and I was thrown out. And I said, "You can't do that. This is open hearing." And the judge says, "I can do it. It's my courtroom, and I'm not letting you have a change of venue because you're writing all these stories." So, of course, I went back to my telephone, called my editor, and demanded an attorney, but they cost money, so they didn't send one up immediately that day. So I'm in the hallway, and there's a break in the testimony, and they bring out David Norman Johnston. Now, if they were in Chester County, there was no way they would have been left loose in Chester County. But the guards were a little far away from them. So I just went up to him, and I said, "David Norman, they won't let me in. That's a violation of rights. What's going on in there?" So they started telling me what was taking place in this hearing. I couldn't get up. And, the guards were kind of sitting there, and they finally, a couple of them came over and said, "Who are you?" And David said, "That's Bruce Mowday from the Daily Local News. Everybody knows Bruce." And they shook their heads and walked away. The Leslie Dale, again, the admitted killer, he always thought, he was a ladies' man. He always thought he was funny. So I'm covering one of the hearings one day, and I called him in my story a hitman. And the next day I got a letter from him, and he signed it Hitman. It's just amazing. He blow kisses to the female prosecutor. It was a character. After he had decided to cooperate with them, he was ready to testify at one of the hearings, and he was being held under guard. And since it was out of county, he was being held in a hotel room. And one morning he asked the guard, said, "Can I order breakfast from the hotel?" And they said, "Sure, call up." And so he calls up the hotel room service and said, "I want eggs done hard, toast burnt, bacon unedible." And they said, "Sir, we can't do that." And he said, "Why not? You did it yesterday." That was the type of guy he was. Also, I'm 99.9% sure of this, that during the whole procedures, the judge in the case, Judge Sugarman, he was a great guy, a really great jurist. He received a complimentary subscription to Playboy magazine, which I'm sure was made by Leslie Dale. And also, in the mail, I received my credentials as a minister, a mail order minister that could marry people. And I'm sure Leslie was the one that put my name in for that also. So it was different things. The Ricky Mitchell that I mentioned, Ricky had suffered from epilepsy and a couple other things. It was a little strange. And one of the state policemen, really good guy, and just straight and narrow, told me, he said, "I never wanted to kill anybody until I met Ricky." It was just the things he did and demanded and wanted, and the whole crew, as you can imagine, interesting personalities.
So I suppose the obvious question that I should ask is, have you married anybody?
I haven't used my credentials. I'm actually getting married on October the 4th.
Oh, wow.
Maybe I can marry myself. How about that?
well, many congratulations for later on in the year.
This actually also has a connection to criminals in the court system. I actually met Joyce 40 years ago, and what took me so long, I have no idea. But I was covering another brutal murder, and you weren't allowed cameras in the courtroom. And I thought we at least need a sketch artist. So I was talking in a restaurant one day with the judge on the case, and I said, I need to find a sketch artist. This is too good to do. And he looks over this woman who was bartending and said, Joyce sketches me all the time. She's really good. And Joyce had just graduated from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and she is great. So I talked with her, and we went to my newsroom. They hired her to do sketches. So for about a week, our first outings together were to murder trials.
Wow.
That's quite a courtship.
I was going to say, absolutely. Yeah, you know.
Get the pun there. Courtship.
I got it. I got it.
We hooked up. Her husband died a few years ago of COVID, and I've been very much at a loose for a number of years, and through social media. And I'm not a dating service, but I promote my talks. And matter of fact, if you look at my social media, you will see a reference to Tall Boy Radio today that I posted before we did this. And I posted I was someplace doing one of my talks, and for the first time I noticed that she had liked it. Joyce did. And, I just wrote back and I said, it's been too long of a time. Let's have lunch. And she agreed. And, after about 10 minutes, it was like those 40 years never, happened. So
wow.
we're really happy.
Well, congratulations, man.
Thank you.
I hope it goes really, really well for you.
Yeah, congratulations. And just for the record, I also am an ordained minister. So if you need somebody, I can step into the
I was
void.
literally just about to say, Beans could marry you.
Oh yeah, well, come on over. It's October the 4th, and you're both very much invited. So.
Oh, thank you very much.
Be careful who you invite. You know what I mean?
Oh, you ought to see some of my friends. I have no.
Listen, you started off looking at mass murderers, so
That's right.
in comparison, we're not so bad.
Yeah, we're okay.
I used to tell people all the time I have friends in low places, so watch it.
You'll fit right in on Tall Boy Radio. So taking you back to the case then. So you mentioned Bruce Jr. Did you want to tell us a little bit about the Kiddie Gang then? How they came to be, and also
the Kiddie Gang were the younger members of the Johnston Gang, and Bruce Johnston Jr. was one of them. There was a guy named Dwayne Lincoln, Sampson brothers. There was a bunch of them, and basically they were employed by the bigger gang at a very small cost to do all the manual labor. Pretty much, they would be lookouts. They would spot. Usually, some of the senior members would spot a tractor out in the field someplace, and they go back that night and set off a couple of the Kiddie Gang out in the field, and they would push the tractor to the edge of the road, and then they would load it on a truck, and it's stolen and it's gone. And usually they were paid off a little bit of marijuana, so it was highly profitable for the Johnsons to do this. And what happened again? They knew they were not supposed to, help the police in any way. So in August of '78, the killing month, that was the month that Robin Miller was murdered, and Bruce Johnston Jr. started cooperating with police. There was a grand jury investigation, and Jr. told them about the Kiddie Gang, and they named his stepbrother Jimmy Johnson. He named Dwayne Lincoln and Wayne Sampson as three of the members, and the police got a hold of them, gave them subpoenas to testify the next week. And what they told Jimmy Johnson was, don't you dare tell your stepfather that you got this, or else you're going to be in danger. Well, of course, that was a big weekend of a big carnival at the Oxford Fire Company. Jimmy was there, and Bruce Johnston Sr. was there. And Jimmy went up to him and said, I just got the subpoena. I don't want to testify. I don't know what to do. And that evening, Senior went back to talk with Norman and David, and they said, what are we going to do? If they testify, we go to prison. So their solution was to kill all three of them. The next morning, they coerced a couple members of their gang to go dig this big grave in a secluded area of Chester County. That evening, they went to Jimmy and told Jimmy, say, hey, look, we got this tractor that's stuck out in this field. Come help put us out, push it out. And so he goes out, he gets to the hole, and Bruce Johnston Sr. kills his stepson. They took the money from his pants pocket before they threw him in. They went to get Dwayne Lincoln. And they told Dwayne, look, we still can't get the tractor out. Come help us. He gets there, and David Johnston shot Lincoln, and he was the victim of David's choice because Lincoln had inadvertently given his name to police on a burglary. They went to get the third victim, and they were taking turns, everybody involved, so one couldn't rat out the other. The Sampson kid came up, same thing, and Ricky Mitchell, the epileptic. And the guy turned around and said, is this a real gun? And Ricky said yes, and finished off the job. And so they had 3 bodies in that grave and covered up. Jimmy Sampson, the brother of the one slain Sampson brother, had threatened the Johnstons after the 3 were missing. He said, you better not do anything to my brother. Wrong thing to say. They took Sampson on supposedly another burglary to a landfill. And it was Norman Johnston's turn to kill somebody, and Norman shot Sampson, and they buried him, and he was the one body that they never ever recovered. So they had that's what happened to the Kitty Gang when they were missing, and before the bodies were found. Just again to show you what kind of family they were. Bruce Johnston Sr. walked into a local diner and looked around, and the maternal grandmother of Jimmy Johnston was there. He didn't say anything to her. He just went over to the jukebox, put it in his quarter, and played Only the Good Die Young, and turned around and walked out.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, these guys were pretty awful.
Yeah, it's pretty cold.
Just one question I ask, and it's something that I've thought. You hear about these gangs, and obviously you're quite close to them. The ladies that are associated, so the wives or the girlfriends, and it makes me wonder whether or not, because of all the killings that have gone on, were they just quiet because they were then scared of repercussions, or so were the ladies, were the wives, girlfriends, did they know what was going on? Were they involved in it? Were they completely oblivious to it? And if they did know, were they effectively so scared that they wouldn't say anything? I've often thought that about the American gangs. Like the wives are almost like the forgotten people in it, because you talk about the men all the time, but actually, it's the ladies of the family as well. And I wonder what impact that would have, sort of thing.
I think at least to the Johnston Gang, I think they all knew what was going on, or at least there was crimes being committed, and maybe not all of them with the murders, but they know they were with the criminals. They lived with them, and they disappeared at night to do the crimes. There was always plenty of money around, and they were arrested and being sent to prison now and again. It's funny to say they were flashy, well dressed. Matter of fact, the first trial with Norman and David, some of the prosecutors were a little afraid that the jurors were paying more attention to the women and what they looked like than to the trial testimony. Bruce Johnston Sr.'s wife, and his second wife, had a nervous breakdown during that trial, and she was going to testify and couldn't do that. And take it away. It took a toll on all of them. Norman Johnston's wife, Susie. Now, Mrs. Johnston, the mother of the 3 brothers, blamed Susie for leading Norman astray. That was kind of convoluted there. It was more of her brothers that led Norman astray. But that's what Mrs. Johnston said. After the murder trials, and the Johnsons, Bruce Sr. and Norman and Susie and Carol Johnston were all arrested while the police were looking for him, and they were arrested after failing to shoplift 8-track tapes. These guys had millions of dollars, and they were arrested. I mean, they wouldn't pay for anything. And later on, it came Susie's turn to be prosecuted, and she was coming up for trial. And she was a very attractive woman. And she called me at the office, and her very sweet voice said, "Bruce, could you do me a favor?" And I said, "Susie, what is it?" She said, "Could you be a character witness for me?" I said, "I don't think so, Susie." So that it was a whole different kind of set, and they had money. They were attractive enough that the women went out with them.
Wow.
So one of the incidents that you mentioned earlier was a very unpleasant treatment of Bruce Jr.'s girlfriend at the time, and it was
Right.
pretty much that led him to testify, wasn't it, when he found out about that? Can you tell us about that incident a little bit more?
Yeah, Bruce Jr. at the time was in Chester County Prison. He was arrested for stealing the backs off of pickup trucks. I said why, but apparently it's a business where pickup trucks get dented, and you can sell them these the backs. And his father had been arrested and spent some time for the same theft like years ago. So Bruce is in prison. Robin Miller, the 15-year-old, wants to visit him. She's too young to drive, the age of 16. So she went to Senior and said, "I want to visit Bruce Jr. Would you give me a ride?" And Senior, being such a great father, said, "Of course, jump in the truck with my with another one of the gang members, and we'll give you a ride." So they start going, and again, Senior's just being such hospitality. He pulls out a bottle of whiskey and bets the 15-year-old she can't drink it. And of course, being a 15-year-old, Robin said, "Sure." Next thing she remembered was the next morning, and she was naked and had been raped in a hotel room.
No.
Again, type of people you're dealing with. She, of course, told Bruce Jr., and that's when Jr. made a call to the Chester County detective's office and said, "I'm ready to, testify, come out." And he started to, and that's when they really got into the federal grand jury and the subpoenaing of the 3 kids and the murders there that went on. So by all accounts, Robin, a nice girl, 15-year-old, fairly decent student, and it's just such a shame.
Yeah. Yeah, that is pretty grim. And one of the other protagonists that I wanted to ask you about as well that we've not mentioned yet is Ansel Ham.
Ansel Ham. My latest book is actually A Killer at the Door, which is about another escape of another guy, but it's through Schiffer Publishing. And Schiffer, a few years ago, called me and asked me if I could do the 50th anniversary book of the murders of 2 Kennett Square policemen. The only person charged and convicted of it was the Ansel Ham. And by the way, Ham died in prison like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
Just left us.
Okay.
Yeah, and I said, yeah, I wanted to, because when I started working at the Daily Local News, and I covered the courthouse for about 15 years, the first case, I didn't cover the trial, but I was there for the appeals of Ansel Ham. So it was sort of a beginning. I did the book, The Jailing of the Johnston Gang, and I did another book called Stealing Wyeth, where some of the Johnston Gang stole paintings by famous artist Andrew Wyeth and his son Jamie. And really, to kind of complete this, was the story on the murders of the 2 Kennett Square policemen. So I said, sure, I did. Ham was a member of the gang. He was actually the safe man I talked about that used a little too much explosives at times, but he thought he could get away with anything. He was an expert marksman. You didn't want to be his next door neighbor, though. because 3 o'clock in the afternoon he gets his gun out and starts shooting it all over the backyard. But the neighbors that were no way were going to complain about him, but he did that on a regular basis. He spent some time in prison. He thought he was big and bad, and he used to drive through Kennett Square, which is part of Chester County in the area where the Johnstons operated. And the police knew he didn't have a license. It had been taken away. And one of the police officers named Davis, when Davis just couldn't stand it. This guy is not going to ruin my town. So he'd stop him every time. And he would give tickets to Ham. Ham get upset. Well, one time he stopped him, and Ham took his car door and smashed it against Davis's knee. They got an altercation. Ham was charged with simple assault or aggravated assault. If convicted because of prior record, he was going to go back to jail. And he had it in for Davis and Davis' partner, a guy named Zagorski. Ham didn't want to go to prison, and he wanted a way not to go to prison, and his solution was kill the two policemen. If he went to prison, he would have been out 6 months for that aggravated assault. He spent 50 some years in prison for what he did next. So one night, November 15th, 1972, actually, two policemen, Davis was one, and Richard Posey had switched with his partner for that night. Posey, both good policemen, good local people. Posey was a father of 4 kids, and I interviewed them for the book. And it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. They investigated a traffic accident, come back to the police station. David gets out of the door. There's one shot fired from a high-powered rifle, strikes, mortally wounds Davis. Posey gets out of the door, not sure where the shot came from, and actually went into the line of fire. One more shot, and he's dead. 2 shots. Ham was a great marksman, and both of them had died. Bruce Johnston Sr. was supposed to have been the getaway driver that day, and David was supposed to have been with Ham when the shots were fired. Some people even suggest maybe it was David that actually fired the shots, but it was more likely it was Ham. He was the marksman. Yeah. Somebody had come up close to the police station just after the shots were fired. Senior panicked, took off, and left his brother and Ham at the scene. Ham lived about a mile away, a straight line from the police station, and they just hoofed it back to Ham's house. The call went out. State police were coming down the bypass close to Ham's house. I think they heard the police, the sirens, and they didn't want to have the gun in their possession. So they took the gun, whacked it, and bent the barrel so they thought they couldn't get ballistics off of it, threw it away, and continued to their house. The investigation, a couple of days, the police right away thought it was Ansel Ham. Matter of fact, it was a state policeman by name of Zagorski. It was Frank Zagorski's brother, and he was sure it was Ham. And they went and they did a search that following Sunday, and what they did was gather a couple hundred people, police officers, firemen, Boy Scouts, and they just almost shoulder to shoulder and walked from the police station out to Ham's house, and they found the rifle. Right. And so they said, aha, but was it Ham's rifle? That's what they had to figure out. And as luck would have it, one of the police officers recognized the rifle. And while Ham was in prison, there was a search warrant served on Ham because they thought he was involved in a burglary of a doctor and some guns were stolen. And they had taken all the weapons out, and they kept a serial number of all the weapons that were taken from Ham's house, including the ones that were returned. And sure enough, one of those rifles was in Ham's house, and the investigation just went from there. One interesting thing that I didn't know, they bent the end of the barrel so they couldn't do the ballistics, but that didn't stop them, the police. Apparently, ballistics are only from the end of the barrel, right at the end, the lands and grooves.
All right.
So they found out that the integrity was fine. And instead of getting up and pointing the gun down into a barrel of water and shooting, they had to put the gun pointed up so the barrel would come down, and they shot it into the water, and they matched that slug with one of the bullets taken from one of the police officer murder victims.
Crazy,
It
yeah.
was.
So, these stories, and they are fascinating, but at the same time, it's quite depressing, isn't it, when you think about the people that lost their lives and the people who were affected by that.
One point I was asked to do a talk on this at a church, and I'm thinking, what am I going to say at a church, about this? But for just the reason you mentioned, and then it struck me. And this is a perfect case to, tell people as an example that evil does exist in this world. And these guys were awful, and they killed innocent people. They ruined families. When I did the book, The Small Town Cops and the Crosshairs, I talked with Posey's 4 children, and one was only 5 years old when his dad died. To talk to them about what it meant to not have the father and how they revered their father and they were proud of their father, and that was the reason they talked to me. They didn't want their father to be kind of lost in this, and they were great interviews, and just kind of great people. The mother, the wife of the slain policeman, they used to have, and every once in a while they do have memorial services to the police.
Yeah.
But she refused to go after a while. It was just such a painful, memory for her.
Right.
But this is awful because, as I tell people, I saw this stuff firsthand. It was not like being on TV where the people come back next week or another episode. There's deaths,
Yeah.
and it's totally different. And it doesn't get solved in a half hour or an hour. Sometimes it takes months and months to solve it.
I've got one question really, and it's more about the sort of process of actually writing the books, and
Right.
and obviously you've written multiple books, and very successful author and all that. What's the process of almost from conception of the idea for the book to then sort of it be published, and how long does that take, and how does that come about, and how do you work with your editor, and do you have, I say, is it a ghostwriter as such, but just talk a little bit about that process of actually developing the book and what goes in it and what's kept out of it and all of that process, because I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, no, great question. I've been doing this for a while. My first book, and I do history and true crime, basically. I've done a business one, sports book. And, I'm lucky. I write about subjects that kind of inspire me or I'm so interested in. Because if I pick something I wasn't interested in, the book's not going to be any good at all.
Yeah.
And luckily, I have a track record where the books have been successful enough that publishers will keep publishing it. And, Barricade Books out of New York State is one of my big ones. Regent out of California, and Shipper here in Pennsylvania are the three ones I use. And it depends on the subject where I go, because not all publishers publish every topic. So
Yeah.
sometimes that kind of gets into it. But normally, what I do, I get an idea. I say, "Wow, that's a book. I'd love to write it." I do some research. I contact one of the publishers, make my pitch. This is it. This is why it should be written. This is the audience. And a lot of authors don't realize when you do the traditional publisher, it's a business. You could have the best book in the world. If they're going to sell 2 copies, they're not going to publish it.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of keep that in mind as I do the pitch, and get over that. And then once I get the the idea with me, I've done this so often, and I actually, the first time I was paid to write professionally, I was 17 years old,
Wow.
and writing for a daily newspaper was sports related, and quickly turned over to hard news. But I've been doing it a while, so I'm not like most authors who will sit down and do the outline. I mean, that's in my mind as I started, and I've learned with my books that like a newspaper article, you got to grab that reader's attention right away. So the first chapter is something I really want to go into, and then I can go back and kind of explain it, and that's how I like to do it. The first book I did, I had an editor who wouldn't allow me to do it, and that's all the publisher did was like beginning to end, and that was the last book I did with that publisher, by the way.
Wow.
But I knew enough at that point to stand up. No, it's better this way, my way.
Yeah.
And I've had good editors for the most part, and a lot of good suggestions, and especially with my history books, I'll get a manuscript and I'll show it to an expert and say, give me the feedback. And I wasn't going to do any books on the Civil War Battle of Gettysburg, big battle, big, monumental here in U.S. history, because I told my publisher asked me to do it. I said, I'm not going to do that. There's 30,000 volumes literally at that point on Gettysburg. The world doesn't need another one.
No.
But I actually had a relative who was wounded in the battle, and I was there one day, and I go a lot, and the one famous part of Gettysburg is Pickett's Charge, the third day, and I just realized I knew nothing about the Union soldiers that saved the nation that day, but I knew a lot about the Southern soldiers that made that monumental charge across a mile open field. And I found out every other book had been written from the Southern perspective. So I called my publisher and I said, these guys told me to write the book. And a lot of that's true. I think the books tell me to write them.
Yeah.
And the publisher agreed. That one took a couple years, a lot of research. The first book I did on the American Revolution, you had to chase down a lot of different facts. Actually, I had to spend 2 weeks in London researching that book. It was tough, I'll tell you. No, I had a great time. I split my time from the Public Records Office to the British Army Museum, and it was on the Battle of the Brandywine, the American Revolution.
Wow.
So, and that one took a long time. Some of them, like the small town cops and the crosshairs, I was lucky that I knew the people, I knew the story, and I kind of hit the ground running. But time crunch for making a 50th anniversary of those murders was closing in. So actually, I researched and wrote it in like 9 months, and we got it out in time. My latest book, and it got a lot of publicity around the world. There was a Brazilian 5 foot, 120 pounds that crab walked up the walls of Chester County Prison, escaped. Actually, we're just at the 2-year anniversary. It took place on Labor Day over here, and spent 2 weeks with the police trying to catch him. Cost $20 million to escape, and it was just awful, and it should never have happened. But again, that they wanted to get that book out as early as possible, and I really worked hard. I would say the bare minimum is a year. If I know the background, if I get to it, but that first book was 5 years. The Gettysburg book was probably 3 years. I can write two at the same time usually, because doing the research on one, I might be writing the other, and then I'll hit a blank spot, or I need to get more information I have, and I'll switch to the other one. So sometimes I can do two at once. But each book's different. Each book has a life of its own. Each book has its own set of problems, and believe me, and the one never ever goes smoothly.
So when you're writing Jailing the Johnston Gang and you're writing the other books that are local to you, who was your target audience? Were you thinking this will be great for true crime, or were you writing it from like a local history perspective, or was it a little bit of both?
It was a little bit of both, but the Johnston book was a little different because usually I have a publisher before I really do all the research and the writing. I wanted to do this book, and I wanted to do it since the early 80s. And after the Johnston trial, I wrote to a number of publishers and was just turned down. They said there's no heroes in this book, and nobody will want to read it. Now, after I don't know how many printings were through, 18 or 19 at this point, they were wrong. There was a movie that came out with Sean Penn and Christopher Walken, At Close Range, loosely based on the Johnston story. It was Johnston's story, but Hollywood eyes. And they made Bruce Johnston Jr., the Sean Penn character, a lot more likable than he really was. Right. That's how that came up. So I'm doing my other books, my history books, and one day I was in the office of the head FBI guy and the state policeman. They both retired and they had their own private detective agency. And I just said, your story, the investigation of the police, how it all happened, is much more interesting than the criminals. Talk to me. And finally, after I asked about 1,000,000 times, they relented. And as soon as they talked to me, other police officers, I talked with former gang members, and that's how, I got that book. And I said, I don't have a publisher, but I'm going to write it.
Yeah.
So I wrote it, and I sent out courier letters to a number of publishers, including Barricade Books in New York. And the publisher, and they did true crime and sort of offbeat stuff. It was a little bit different what they did, but they were really intrigued about it. And we went back and forth, and I said, I don't want an advance. Most authors get an advance. And I said, I don't need an advance. I don't want to earn my money when it's sold. And the publisher, Carol Stewart, said, are you sure? I said, yes. So she gave me a contract, and that's how that book kind of came about. That was a little bit unusual, but usually I have an agreement or a possibility of agreement before I really jump into it.
Yeah, cool. So one final question for me then. Do you have any final questions that are unanswered that you'd like to ask the Johnston Gang?
Yeah, I really could. Bruce Sr. and David have died. Ansel is dead. Ricky Mitchell is dead. Leslie Dale is dead. Norman Johnston's still alive. I wish, and I actually wrote a letter to Norman and said, I'd love to interview you, but only if you're honest with me. I'd love to get into his head and find out, there's more causes to this than just, they like the easy money.
Yeah.
Was the mother involved? And some people thought the mother was like the mom Barker. I don't think so. She definitely knew what was going on. How did you have any remorse? Are you sorry about it? I mean, there's so many things from that personal perspective that I wish you'd sit down and talk with me.
You got any final questions, guys?
No, it's funny because that question that you've just asked was one of the questions I was going to ask Bruce earlier when you were sat with Senior. Were there actually any questions that you wish you'd have asked on in hindsight at that time? Because you talk to other people who've interviewed various, and it's like, I wish, in hindsight, I wish I'd have asked that, or I wish I'd have found out about that, so almost that question was sort of similar. Is that, on reflection, was there anything either that you wish you hadn't asked because that put their back up, or was there something that you really wish that you had asked that you didn't?
I asked every question I thought I could get a really good answer at.
Right.
I know interviewing him, in that prison, he wasn't going to admit to anything. He wasn't, I didn't want to waste the time. Say, well, where were you, and did you hire your brothers? And that was sort of out in the public, but he wasn't going to admit to it. So, I was real satisfied with the interview. I'm sure if I go back now, I'd probably, why didn't I ask this? Or
Yeah.
something like that, because there's always kind of that hindsight. Being a newspaper reporter kind of helps me, because I had that daily deadline. You had the editor sitting there whipping you if you didn't make the deadline.
Right.
That kind of helps with the writing of books, because every author wants to do one more interview or something. The Cavalcante book, I actually talked with 80 people and did 44 more interviews. And I know to make the deadline, I just had to sit there and write.
Cool. So we normally wrap things up round about the hour mark. We've shot a little bit over, but that's just fine because we've really enjoyed this conversation. So I'll put a link in the show notes to the audio version of this podcast. But did you want to tell our listeners where they can go about and find your books?
Oh, absolutely. I do. Thank you. It's my favorite question. And send me the links and stuff, and I'll post them up on my social media. Actually, I have a website, www.mowday.com. They list all my books, all my background. My email is mowday, MOWDAY, at mowday.com. Love to hear from your listeners, anybody who wants the book. I think you can probably get most of them in the UK. If not, I can mail them. We can make arrangements. I can do personal, kind of inscriptions. And of course, if you guys ever have put on a true crime seminar, you can invite me over and we can do a seminar and talks and everything. I love to do that. I think last year I did 80 some either talks, interviews, signings, and do about that many this year. Yeah. I love talking with the people and getting the feedback. It's great if they buy the books, but I get so much out of every one of the kind of the interactions like with this one. Thank you guys for doing so.
Oh, no, it's been an absolute pleasure. It has been an absolute pleasure. Like I say, I picked up a copy of your book, and I will, of course, like I say, stick a link in the show notes to it. Gaz, have you got any final thoughts, Steve?
Look, I love the fact that we love guests from over the pond, from the States. I love new guests, and I love listening to their story and just getting to know them a little bit. I genuinely, Bruce, it's a massive thank you for me. I've really, really, really enjoyed the episode. Love listening to your take on obviously the crimes and the books and stuff you've written. So big thank you from me. Thank you very much for giving up your time just to talk to us and give us a little bit of an insight into yourself and your career and your book. So massive thank you. And I say I hope all of our listeners have enjoyed the episode. I'm sure they will. I've got absolutely no doubt that they won't. So it's been absolutely fascinating, and just thank you very much.
Thank you both.
No, indeed. Like I say, just to sum up what Gaz said, totally agree with everything he said. Vic Ferrari, he's a mutual friend of ours. You guested on his podcast, and he's a huge fan of your book. Before he was a podcaster, he read it, I think, May. I don't know when he actually read it, but certainly before he joined us on our show. So I might have read it before he started writing his own book. So as soon as he said he was interviewing you and did we want to interview you, our answer was absolutely yes. So thank you very much for joining us. I've really enjoyed it. I've got your book here as well. Well, my kids give me 5 minutes peace. I will endeavor to read it.
That's the toughest part. Yes.
Yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We will be back next week when we will be talking about something entirely different altogether.